Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Terumos, Chapter 4, Halacha 3, Part 2 of the Shir, and in the Art Scroll we're on 36a1. Today I'm doing the Shir well. So today we're really going to be covering an interesting topic that comes up. We're going to be dealing with Rabbi Yochanan and the tradition that he got on tithing. Now, so far, we've been dealing with minimums for tithing, and later on in Chapter 4, Halacha 4, we're going to be dealing with what is the maximum, what's the most that you can tithe. Right now, we're dealing with, in Chapter 4, Halacha 3, what is the minimum you can tithe, and then we're going to be dealing with the maximum. And later on, actually to start, Rabbi Yochanan is going to be getting and touching into part of, from the tradition that he has from Chapter 4, Halacha 4 on, showing his tradition from the maximum, which is not the halacha. Now, I want to point out a touchstone Mishnah from Kalayim, Chapter 2, Halacha 8, that shows, I think, what's going on in the Gemara that's to follow. The Gemara that's going to be coming up is going to show three cases of Rabbi Yochanan holding the minor opinion as what is the halacha. Now, he's saying it because he's saying what is his tradition. He's not saying it because he's saying that this is in fact the halacha. He's saying that this is a tradition he had. Now, keep in mind, Rabbi Yochanan was the one who wrote the Yerushalmi. And what does he do? He puts in the major opinion, the majority opinion. So while he may be saying the minority opinion that he has, which is the tradition that he has, in fact, at the end of the day, he's writing in the majority opinion. And he puts that in the text. So I think a lot of what's happening here is a lot like Kalayim 2.8. So let me read that to you right now. It says, over there in Kalayim 2.8, it says, if grain leans over vegetables or vegetables lean over grain, it is permitted except for the case of the Greek gourd. And there's a dissent. Rabbi says, Chait melons and Egyptian beans also may not lean over other plants. However, I favor the words of the sages over my own. In other words, Rebbe has a tradition that these other plants that have vines and tendrils and very, very large leaves, not just the Greek gourd, but these also are especially entangling. And according to the tradition that Rebbe got from his teachers, the stalks of the Chait melons and Egyptian beans are so entangling that they also could not be permitted to mingle with other crops, even when you're sowing them properly with an unplanted space between. Rebbe himself, however, sees the tradition that the majority and that the sages have as correct, and he cedes over to that opinion. Now, that's recorded here in the text. Now, keep in mind, Rabbi Yochanan is doing the same thing. He is saying what is his tradition that he received, and then he is actually recording in the text, just like Rebbe recorded in the text, that he accepts the views of the majority opinion. How do you know he accepts the view of the majority opinion? Rabbi Yochanan writes it in here. So the Mishnah states regarding somebody who separates one part in 60. Again, we're dealing with minimums. And the Mishnah over there says that if we went back and added to the Truma, the additional amount is not Truma, and therefore would be subject to Meiser. So the Gemara is going to qualify this rule. Rabbi Issi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, this is stated where someone intends his original designation to exempt his pile entirely. But where, however, one did not intend the original designation to exempt the pile entirely, but intended to designate further Truma, the additional Truma is valid, even in a ratio of 1 part Truma to 1 part Hulin. Now, this 1 part Truma to 1 part Hulin is going to be coming up in the Mishnah in Chapter 4, Halacha 4. That's going to be dealing with the maximum. So, Rabbi Yochanan is effectively saying the minority opinion of Rabbi, I think it's Rabbi Yishmael over there, which Rabbi Yishmael is deriving what is the maximum from a biblical verse. And so the tradition that Rabbi Yochanan got is going to be from the tradition that also Rabbi Yishmael has. That's not going to be the halacha. I know that that's not the halacha because over there in chapter 4, halacha 4, there are two Tanaim that dissent. It's Rabbi Yishmael versus Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva, and you have 2 verses 1. And also in Peah 1:1, the Gemara is referring to the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva as the halacha. And so Rabbi Yochanan is going to be allowing, like in this tradition, half of the pile to be designated as truma. In other words, 1 part to truma and 1 part of hulin. In other words, if I have 100 sa'ah of grain and I want to separate out truma, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is going to be that you could separate out 50 as the maximum amount, and the rest always has to be left as hulin. And the Rosh Cirilio, by the way, the great Yerushalmi commentator, is also going to be saying that this follows the view of Rabbi Yishmael, who gives this as the maximum truma designation. Now, the Mishnah is ruling that when a person designates 1/60th of a pile as truma, that truma is valid, and the pile is rectified. In other words, you don't have any tevel in it anymore. And all the further separations that you have don't become truma. You have to go through the next set of tithing. In other words, there are 5 sets of tithing if you're going to be making like challah, right? Otherwise, you're going to be having 4 sets of tithing. And you have to, after you separate out this, you have to now go on to the next one. So Rabbi Yochanan is basically saying that if you're doing further separations, you didn't make truma, and really it's just going to be hulin, and it's subject to the rest of the tithes, the next set of this chain of tithes. Now, Rabbi Yochanan here is stating that, says the Pnei Moshe, that this holds true only where somebody intended the initial separation to rectify the entire pile, and in that case, everything in the pile becomes hulin, and therefore can't be designated as truma. But where somebody does not intend the initial designation to rectify the pile and plans to separate further portions of truma, in other words, he's doing it in 2 steps. He's going to separate out something as truma, but he acknowledges that he's going to be doing a 2-step process. So then the pile remains tevel even after the designation of 1/60th as truma. Why? Because the designation for truma is not completed. In other words, the person came along and said he's doing it in a 2-step process. Now, we covered this before in page 33 in the art scroll, and the additional truma that he designates in this second step, just like in page 33, is going to be entirely valid, and it's not subject to those ties. That's what we're talking about. In other words, we're talking about where you decided that you're going to be doing it as a 2-step process. Now, the Mishnah ruled regarding somebody who separated truma by estimate, and truma is supposed to be by estimate, right? Truma gadol is supposed to be by estimate, but the other ones are supposed to be by exact measure. So if he brought up in his hand 1 part in 61, that's not going to be truma, and he has to add truma until the total equals the usual gift. Now the Gemara is going to cite a dispute regarding this ruling. So Kana says, this is going to be Rav Kana in the Bavli. Kana says, and this by the way is Rabbi Yochanan's student who came from Bavel. Kana says that he can separate only his usual amount of truma, nothing more. In other words, Pnei Moshe is pointing out that anything he designates beyond his usual amount is invalid. So, according to Kana, says Amar Fulda, when the Mishnah states that he must go back and separate his usual amount of truma, it means that he must separate precisely that amount, no more, no less. So, Kana is reasoning that once the usual amount, say like 1/50th, has been separated like what the owner originally intends to do or usually does, then that tithing process for Truma Gedola comes to an end, the pile's rectified, and he has to go on to the next set of tithes. And so whatever is going to exceed that usual measure, according to Kana, is not deemed to be part of the Truma, and it belongs to the remainder of the pile. So that is going to be chulin. So effectively what Kana says is if you're going to be going over if your normal tithing is 1/50th, and you're going to be going over that amount, let's say you pulled up 1 in 61, 1 out of 61 parts, and you're going to normally tithe 150, and you're doing this all by estimate, and you come and you take up a second pile to bring it up over 1 in 60, and then also get it up to your original amount. But according to Kana, if you over tithed it, you brought up more than 1 in 50, which is going to be 2%, then what did you do, right? He's going to be saying that the part that's over your normal amount is going to be chulin. So you might actually end up with a pile that has some truma in it, some truma gedola in it, and some chulin in it. But Rabbi Yochanan dissents to that. He doesn't agree. He says that the additional amount of truma that you're pulling up is valid even if it ends with a ratio of 1 part truma, 1 part chulin. And he's not concerned or constrained by his usual practice. Again, here we go. We're talking about what is the maximum according to the tradition of Rabbi Yochanan, which is Rabbi Yishmael, which is the minority opinion, which is not the halacha. So very, very unusual here. He's recording this, but nonetheless, he's recording the tradition that he got, even though this is not necessarily halacha. So Rabbi Yochanan is holding that since the initial designation didn't fulfill the truma requirement, in other words, he pulled up less than 1 in 60, and now the act of tithing is not complete, but he's in progress until he goes and he separates as much as he wants. Now, Rabbi Yochanan's view is going to be the following. He's going to be saying that the tithing process doesn't end with the separation of the usual amount. In other words, if you're normally giving 1 in 50 and you got it up to 1 in 50 or more than 1 in 50, the extra amount that you did is still going to be Truma Gedola. It's not going to be a mixture. It's not going to be partially chulin. It doesn't end at that. In other words, it still continues. So, again, this is going to be, again, going back to this two-step process that we talked about on page 33 in the art scroll, and also dealing with, okay, I went to go separate it, and it was under this minimum amount, but I want to keep doing it. I want to continue the process. So he says you can do it even up to the biblical maximum, which is going to be 1 part truma, 1 part chulin, which again is the minority opinion. So what do we see here, right? So we're seeing that the designation of the extra amount is going to be deemed to be part of this tithing process, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, it's going to be deemed to be truma. Now, this part might actually be the halacha, right? But what is not the halacha is 1 part chulin, 1 part truma. In other words, the biblical maximum that he's talking about from the tradition that he has, okay, that's not going to be the halacha. But this two-step process that he's talking about, where the part that he takes, which is under the 1 in 60 amount, under what the sages prescribed, and then he's coming and he's adding to it to bring it up to make sure that this pile is going to be halachic truma, and you've over-tithed it. He's saying that this over-tithe is still part of the tithing process as this two-step process, and you finished it, right? You don't have in here, like what Kana says, where 1 part is going to remain as chulin. The entire part that you took out to bring it up over that minimum tithing level is still going to be Truma Gedola. And so Rabbi Yochanan is basically going to be saying that this is going to be a valid process, and that you don't have some sort of mixture in here where you have part Truma Gedola and chulin in there. Now the Gemara is going to challenge Rabbi Yochanan's view on the basis of this Mishnah. He says, but we learned in our Mishnah that he must go back and separate his usual amount of Truma. So maybe this is going to limit, like what Kana is saying, the total Truma separation to the amount that he usually designates, which is going to be contrary to what Rabbi Yochanan says. In other words, according to Kana, when the Mishnah states that he has to go back and separate the usual amount of Truma, it means he must separate precisely that amount, not more, not less. In other words, he gives 1/50, and he under-tithed, and he has to go back and add to it. What are you going to go do? What do you got to go do? You got to go bring it up to 1/50. But whatever you bring up over that normal amount is not going to be Truma Gedola, according to Rav Kana's reading of this Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. The extra amount that you have, that's still going to be a Truma Gedola. Now, the Gemara is going to dismiss this challenge. And Mishnah is simply saying that one may not subtract from the usual gift. In other words, the reading that Rabbi Yochanan would come back and say is going to be that his usual amount represents a maximum, is not a maximum, it's a minimum. In other words, what he's going to be saying, says Mara Fulda, that the Mishnah over here is saying that one may not designate less than his usual amount. And the intention is not to prohibit a larger Truma designation. So in other words, they're saying that you're reading, you're reading this wrong, okay? This is saying that is not a maximum amount. That represents the minimum amount. In other words, the minimum that you can give is still going to be 1/50. In other words, you bring up in your hand to get up in the second step process to get up to 150. That's the minimum, but you can leave more. Now, there's a different response. Rabbi Lazar says like this. Rabbi Lazar says that the Mishnah mentions the usual amount to emphasize that even his usual gift may be measured by volume and need not be estimated. Now, this is a big hiddush here. Now, normally, Truma Gedola is going to be by estimate. Now, you under-tithe, right? Now, you want to bring it up to your normal amount, okay? So you're doing this two-step process, and basically what they're saying is they're saying that in order to measure it, that in order to get it up to that amount, you can measure it. That's a big hiddush here. So, according to Rabbi Lazar, this Mishnah really, by saying his usual amount, is saying that it's going to permit this second tithe to be separated by precise measure to get it up to this minimum amount. And so, this Mishnah is extending this permit even to the part of tithing that represents his usual Truma gift. Now, again, Truma is normally separated by estimate, but the Chiddush here by Rabbi Lazar in reading this Mishnah is when it says by his normal gift, it means that you can measure the second part to get it to be precisely up to that amount. Let's say 1/50. That's a big Chiddush here. And he continues and he says, rather, if he intends to add to his usual gift, it's permitted and he may measure it even by volume. In other words, you're normally going to separate Truma by estimate, not volume. And this is intended to encourage, by the way, somebody to give Truma generously. The Rosh talks about this in the Mishnah in 1:4, page 12 in the Art Scroll. Now, in this case, where the owner anyway is going to surpass his usual gift, Rabbi Lazar is going to extend this to say that anything extra that you're going to do after, say, your normal minimum amount of, say, 1/50, is to say that you can measure that too. In other words, this permit that the Mishnah mentions to add to your gift and to measure it, that could be measured too. That's a big hiddush as well. So in this case, where the owner anyway is surpassing the usual gift, the idea is that you can now measure this extra part by volume as well, and that's a big surprise because it's a big departure from where we have. Maybe that's why this is in the Mishnah. So the Gemara is going to ask a question as to the status of Truma added by one who initially separated out only one part in 61. In other words, he went and he tithed an under amount, which is not going to rectify Doraita is not going to rectify, or Derabanan is not going to rectify this pile, and now he's going to add to it. So we want to know what happens if you undertithe them. So Rabbi Yonah says that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish posed the following question before Rabbi Yochanan, and we're going to be getting into the second case where Rabbi Yochanan has a tradition that's different from the Tanakama, however, records the majority opinion. So we're going to be getting into it. And so, according to Rabbi Yonah, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish posed this question before Rabbi Yochanan. It says like this. It says that the additional truma added by one who separates less than 160, what is the status? This is a leading question because Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish here he's not playing dumb. He wants to know what exactly is the tradition that you hold, and what do we do with it? What's the halacha? So it's really what he's asking is like this. This truma is required by rabbinic law only, okay? And is it regarded as full-fledged truma, in which case it's exempt from Meiser, or is it not truly regarded, and then in that case it's subject to Meiser? In other words, the Mishnah ruled that where a person separated less than 1/60th, in that case, he doesn't fulfill the minimum rabbinic obligation. Therefore, he's obligated by rabbinic law to add to this truma designation. The Gemara is wondering, really, says the Vilna Goan, whether this additional separation, which was required by rabbinic law, is afforded the status of full-fledged truma, in which case it is not subject to other ties like Meiser, or whether it is not endowed with full truma status, in which case it is subject to Meiser. Now, ordinarily, one's entire truma gift is exempt from Meiser, but with biblical truma, the obligation required is only going to be a smaller amount of truma, and the required increase is a matter of rabbinic law only. So this increase to the normal gift is not deemed to be rabbinic truma. So biblical law prohibits a large truma gift as well. So therefore, what we're saying is that maybe biblically, if you're under tithing it and you're taking up a second amount, well, maybe biblically that's going to be subject to the next set of tithes like Meiser Rishon and separating out Trumas Meiser and everything else. So the question is, when you're under tithing it, right? You did something on a biblical level, and so whatever you're taking out after that, that's going to be a rabbinic thing, right? So Rish Lakish is asking a very charged question here. He's saying, really, what is the status of the second thing that you're pulling up? And you're saying, okay, very nice that you're giving part of it over to Truma Gedola and that you're adding to your gift, but isn't it biblically subject to Maestros? So Gemara is going to answer. And Rabbi Yochanan says to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, says that I teach this law in the name of the individual Tana, namely Rabbi Yudah of our Mishnah. In other words, the sages are going to be holding, that's going to be the Tanakama of our Mishnah, that they're going to be holding a dispute with Rabbi Yudah on this matter. So Rabbi Yochanan says the Pnei Moshe responds that he ruled on this question in accordance with a single Tana, Rabbi Yudah, who disputes his colleagues, the Tanakama, regarding the status of the additional Truma. So the Vilna Goan, by the way, amends this text a little bit. He's saying that to amend it, to explicitly say that I teach this law in the name of Rabbi Yudah. So again, this is not normally the way this is done, right? We don't normally go by one Tana over the Tanakama, the majority of the Tanaim here. So what's going on? And that's a very curious thing. In other words, I think what's happening is a lot like what we saw in Kalayim, where he has this tradition, right? And the tradition that he got is for maximums is going to be like Rabbi Yishmael. Over here on what is this rabbinic, extra that you're adding, this amount, and how does that work? That's going to be like Rabbi Yudah, again, minority. So how does this work? So the Gemara is going to look at how does Rabbi Yuda's ruling work. And it says that if you will say that Rabbi Yuda ruled, let me continue. It says Rabbi Yochanan cited the source of his ruling, Rabbi Yuda, but neglected to supply the ruling itself. And the Gemara asks and says, well, what was Rabbi Yochanan's ruling in the name of Rabbi Yuda? In other words, he says he rules by Rabbi Yuda, but on what part of the law? How does that work? And he's saying, was the ruling in the name of Rabbi Yuda? Was it to impose the Meiser obligation upon the additional Truma, or was it to exempt the Truma from Meiser? In other words, when you say that you ruled by Rabbi Yuda, what exactly did Rabbi Yuda say? That's the big question here. So the Gemara now is going to try to figure out that what is Rabbi Yuda's ruling in the context of this, and what is Rabbi Yochanan agreeing with Rabbi Yuda on. So if you're going to say, says the Gemara, that Rabbi Yuda ruled to impose a Meiser obligation on this additional Truma that you pulled up, everything's fine, and the sage's dissenting view is understandable. So that, in other words, the sages would be saying that the additional Truma is regarded as full-fledged Truma, therefore exempt from Meiser. And if you're going to say that Rabbi Yuda ruled to exempt the additional Truma from Meiser, then it's hard to understand why the sages are dissenting. Consider like this, says the Gemara. If Rabbi Yuda, who holds the additional Truma, may be separated from produce that's not in close proximity, still says that this Truma is exempt from Meiser, then the sages and the Tanna Kama, who do not agree with that remaining Truma may be separated from produce that's not in close proximity, then is it not certain that they too exempt it from Meiser? In other words, this would contradict Rabbi Yochanan's statement, which attributes the exemption to Rabbi Yuda only, not the sages. So what Rabbi Yochanan is saying in all of this is that, according to Rabbi Yuda, if you're going to read it this second way, then the additional Truma is subject to Meiser, while the sages are exempting it. So Rabbi Yuda ruled over here that over here. I mean the concern. Rosh Aurelio is going to say that the Gemara's question is going to be a concern on different penalties connected with the use of Truma by a non-Kohen. So a non-Kohen who eats Truma is liable to death at the hands of heaven. He has to pay extra fifth. Gemara's wondering whether the same is going to be true for this additional Truma removed in the Mishnah's case. Now, Rabbi Yochanan is responding that he ruled on this question in accordance with a single Tana, Rabbi Yuda, who disputes his colleagues, the Tanna Kama, regarding the status of this additional Truma. So Rabbi Yuda ruled in the Mishnah that the additional Truma separated by somebody who originally designated less than 1/60th does not need to be in close proximity to the pile. That, by the way, indicates that, in this respect at least, the rabbis did not grant this tithe the status of full-fledged Truma. Now, this might indicate that in this respect, that tithe is regarded maybe by the sages' view as full-fledged Truma. In other words, what Rabbi Yuda is saying is that because you can separate it out as doesn't need to be in proximity, it's saying that, according to Rabbi Yuda, that there's a lesser status to this additional amount you're pulling over. It's not exactly biblical Truma Gedola. And the Tanna Kama is effectively saying, no. This tithe, this extra amount that you're pulling up, is full-fledged Truma and in every single way. In other words, you don't have a case where this extra part that you're pulling up is now subject to maestros in the second, third, fourth set of tithes. And also, you don't have a case where, you have a mixture of hulin in there. In other words, you did something that is fully rectified as fully Truma Gedola. And it seems that maybe Rabbi Yuda, it's again two ways to read Rabbi Yuda. So there's a Amara who disputes Rabbi Yochanan and is going to try to explain that the sages are also going to be saying that this additional Truma is subject to Meiser. So Rabbi Yosei, this is the Amara, came and says in the name of Rabbi Issi, who says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that the additional Truma is subject to Meiser even according to the sages of the view of the sages. In other words, that what we're trying to figure out is, Rabbi Yehuda must be holding that this amount is not, this amount that you're pulling out extra must be subject to Meiser, must not exactly be Truma Gedola. Okay, that's one way to read it, says the Pnei Moshe. Now, according to what Rabbi Yosef, the Amarah, says about what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying, is that the sages are viewing the proximity not as proof that they're going to treat this tithe as truma with regard to the law of Meiser as well. He's ruling that, according to the sages, that this truma is not treated also as full-fledged truma, and also is subject to Meiser. So, again, what exactly is Rabbi Yochanan saying here? Now, Rabbi Zera comes and says to Rabbi Issi, says that which Mishnah implies that the additional truma is exempt from Meiser. And the Gemara is saying that Rabbi Issi does not answer him. And Rabbi Zera says to him, perhaps it is that which we learned in our Mishnah, this very Mishnah, as follows. It says, if someone separated truma by estimate, and he brought up in his hand only 1 part in 61, in other words, less than 1 in 60, it is truma. But he must go back and separate his usual amount of truma. And according to this ruling, the Mishnah did not teach that if he went back and added to the truma, it is subject to Meiser. In other words, we can infer that the Mishnah's omission that the additional truma is exempt from Meiser. In other words, what we say here is explained by Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur. He's saying that in the earlier case of the Mishnah, where somebody initially separated the minimum amount of truma, the Mishnah informs us that any additional truma that's taken is subject to Meiser. And in this case, however, the Mishnah states that no such requirement, which implies that there is none. So the Meiser obligation applies only where he fulfilled the minimum requirement. So since there's no further truma obligation, his next set of tithing in this second step of the process is not considered to be truma, and therefore subject to Meiser. But where, however, he did not fulfill the minimum requirement, and this is Rabbi Zera's point, according to Rabbi Kanievsky, and you have to have a further separation to make it necessary, then the subsequent tithing is considered to be truma, and therefore exempt from Meiser. In other words, that's how Rabbi Zera is reading this. So the Mishnah sets forth rabbinic guidelines for separating truma. And the Gemara is now going to talk about the Doraita requirement. And again, this is going to be another departure from the view of the Tanna Kama. So the Gemara says like this: how much truma is required for a person to exempt his tevel produce by biblical law? Now, by the way, the thing that Rabbi Zera says, as explained by Rabbi Kanievsky, is going to be saying that, according to the sages, this extra amount that you're taking up is exempt from Meiser and is full-fledged truma. Okay? That's very important to do. Why? How can that be? Why would that be? Because I think what the Tanna Kama would say is that you normally are tithing this amount, and you separated something smaller. So it was always your intention to tithe a certain amount. And so now if you decide to add to it in this second step process, that second step process that you do, that's Truma Gedola. And the Tanna Kama is saying it's not subject to the next set of tithes, the Maestros, Meiser Rishon. Why? Because it's full-fledged Truma. I think that's what the argument of the sages, and that's going to be the Halacha. And so again, that's a departure. And so that's very unusual. We're going to get another departure here by Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan, in the end, does put in the majority opinion, though he does record his minority opinion. So the Mishnah sets forth these, rabbinic guidelines for separating truma. What about the biblical requirement? Gemara says, how much truma is required for a person to exempt his tevel produce by biblical law? In other words, Doraita. Rabbi Yochanan says, here's the departure, 1 part in 100, like Trumas Meiser. Big Kiddush. Now, B'nai Moshe is going to say like this. He's going to say that Truma Meiser consists of a tenth of one's Meiser Rishon, which, by the way, is a tenth of the crop. Now, if you open up the Torah, that's what the Torah says. It's a precise measure. I mean, I know that because I open up the Torah, I read it in black and white, right? So, therefore, somebody's Truma Meiser equals 1/100th of the crop. Rabbi Yochanan is holding that the biblical measure for Truma Gedola is derived from Trumas Meiser, which is, by the way, the third in the set of tithes. First, you have the Meiser Rishon, and the Meiser Rishon is the second set. Truma Meiser is the third set of tithes that is there in the chain of tithing, and that's going to be 1 in 100. That's what it works out to be mathematically. So, Rabbi Yochanan is holding that in the text of the Torah refers to is equating Trumas Meiser and Trumos, and by a Gezerah Shava, I think, basically Rabbi Yochanan is going to be saying over here, because Truma is referred to and sometimes as Truma Meiser in the book of Numbers, then over here, this is also going to be how we know, just like in the book of Numbers, where it's talking about Truma in relation to Truma Meiser, it's going to have characteristics of Truma Meiser. So accordingly, somebody who is going to be designating 1/100th of the crop as Truma fulfills the biblical obligation. Now, some commentators point out that Rabbi Yochanan rules in the Bavli of Avodah Zarah, page 73b, that there's no set measure for Truma, and he's going to be saying over there that even a single grain of wheat can rectify the entire pile of tevel. This would seem to contradict this biblical maximum over here of 1/100th of the pile. Now, according to some, the correct reading here might be that we're not talking about Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yonatan. So it's hard to know which is which, but I'm reading it as Rabbi Yochanan, and that's the way that most people are reading this. So the Gemara wants to know, well, what exactly is the source for, where did Rabbi Yochanan get this? And Rabbi Yonatan says to him that, from who did you learn this? Where did you learn this from? And he says to Rabbi Yonatan, I learned this from the discussion of the scholars. In other words, he's saying that by being in the academy and listening to the elders that I was listening to, this is where I got this tradition. Okay, big Kiddush. So there's a different view, and the Gemara again is now written by Rabbi Yochanan. He presents the majority view. And in other words, even though Rabbi Yochanan got, like what Rabbi got from his teachers, a different tradition, and he's recording what that tradition is, why are they recording this tradition? Because, like what the Mishnah says elsewhere, if you heard that, this tradition, and you're seeing it from a minority opinion, and it's there in the Gemara or in Mishnah as a minority opinion, it's to tell you that that's not the tradition. We go by the majority. So Rabbi Yanai says that even 1 part in 1,000 fulfills the biblical Truma obligation. So then, in other words, that what this is saying is that, says Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur, that there's no measure for Truma. You have to leave something, but there's no actual measure. And the next one in the Gemara, to sum it up, says, Rabbi Mana says that there's no minimum measure for Truma by biblical law. For it's written regarding the Truma over in Devarim 18:4, talking about delineating gifts due to Kohanim and from the rest of the nation. It says, the first of your grain, your wine, and your oil. And the verse does not specify the size of the gift, which implies even the smallest amount, whatever that may be. So, in other words, what this is saying is even a single kernel of grain can suffice. In other words, what this is saying by Rabbi Mana is that there's no minimum measure of Truma And that's one way to read it. Now, there's another way to read this. The Mara Fulda explains this part by Rabbi Manna like this, saying that when we're talking about this minimum measure of truma, one part in 1,000, or no minimum measure. Since Truma's Meiser itself measures only 1/10 of the crop, this measure of Truma comes to 1/10, 1 in 10,000. So Rabbi Yochanan then is inquiring as to the source of this measure, and Rabbi Hanan elsewhere is responding that it represents a compromise of sorts between the view of Rabbi Yanai, who gives 1 in 1,000, and a minimum measure, and that of what Rabbi Manna says, which is going to be no minimum measure at all. So there's a variation of the text where Rabbi Hanan is in here, and I don't have this in here. So the normal Yerushalmi text does not include Rabbi Hanan's view, but there is a text that does have Rabbi Hanan as having 1 in 10,000. So the halacha, though, is going to be like what Rabbi Manna says, which is that there's no minimum measure for truma. And so what do we see from all of this, right? We're seeing that there's an order to learning Torah and Gemara, and we have a structure for it, and we follow the majority of the sages. So even if you have a minority opinion and you have a tradition that comes from a minority opinion, it's very nice. But like what Rabbi did, Rabbi says, okay, I cede to the sages, and that's what we have to do as well. So in a world today where you have, lots of modern Orthodox saying, all these interesting hetters, and you have a lot of conservative Jews in America, or Reform Jews, or people who don't learn so much and are making things up by their own logic, we always have to go by what the majority of quality Torah scholars say in terms of what is the halacha, and what is that going to be? That's going to be what the Shulchan Aruch says. And that's why it's important to learn practical halacha every day, and to respect the structure that we have, which has been handed over to us. And that's effectively what Rabbi Yochanan's doing by recording what the majority opinion is in these three cases, even though his tradition is not the same. Have a great day.